next session. And did you enjoy the lunch? I had a great lunch. That was so good. I love eating here. I love the music here, the food here. Everything's great here. The friendship, the fellowship. I got to pull up my new PowerPoint for the afternoon session, so you'll have to just give me a moment, because you know me in multitasking. The miraculous rise of liberty. There it is. You know from Revelation chapter 12, my Bible got put down there. Oh, you got me a new charger cord. Thank you for that. Appreciate that. That's not even mine, and it fits, and it works. It works. I've never replaced the charger cord effectively that easily, because all of these have different size. You didn't. Wait a minute. So that one is mine? Oh, you just kind of sutured it up a little bit, huh? What a blessing. Thank you. That's awesome. That's awesome. I'll put it back down here. But the miraculous rise of liberty. Let's get on to the afternoon message here. And you'll see momentarily PowerPoint, enable editing, and then there we go. I got goofed up a while back on my, by the way, I don't normally put my own picture on my opening slide. That's what Amazing Facts did. But I got goofed up on my keystroke shortcuts a while back. I used to go FN, Shift, F5, boom, and I've done that 100 times at speaking events. So if anybody knows how to reverse that so that I get my keys back, because they're not working right now, so that's why I'm doing that. But anyway, let's get started, shall we? We should begin with prayer this afternoon, shouldn't we? Let's pray. Father in heaven, we are so thankful for the Sabbath day you've given to us, a day to reflect on you as our Creator, our Sustainer, our Redeemer, and our soon-coming King. I pray that as we look at these historical facts through the lenses of prophecy and the principles of your kingdom, and through the lenses of providential history, we ask for your wisdom and guidance as we study through this. In Jesus' name, amen. The miraculous rise of liberty. This session is largely comprised of miracle stories. I was collecting miracle stories in American history a while back, so we'll do a lot of that. But I want to start with a quotation from Testimonies, a very short quotation, from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1, page 264. And this was stated in the context of the Civil War that was going on during the time of the early Advent movement there in Volume 1 of the Testimonies. And the statement was that God has the destiny of this nation in his hands. Isn't that an interesting statement right out of the gates? When you study American history particularly, and not at the exclusion of God is guiding everybody, every human, everywhere, but nations that have a prophetic implication, who are prophesied about in Revelation 13 as becoming a second beast that speaks like a dragon, or in Revelation 12 as being the place where the earth helped out the woman. That's going to be a place that God exercises special interest in, the destiny of that nation being so prophetically significant. So the scripture for the afternoon is the same one from this morning, and the earth helped out the woman. This doesn't apply just to 1620. We kind of pinpointed that as really the beginnings and the origins of America. Maybe during Q&A somebody would say, why did you do 1620 and not 1607 with Jamestown? But that's another discussion. I kind of like to base the origins and the foundation of the American Republic in that 1620 arrival, not 1630 with Massachusetts Bay, but 1620 with Plymouth Colony. We'll see the difference between those two as we go forward. But the earth helped out the woman applies to all of this history of finding freedom to worship. And that particularly happened in America, a relatively unpopulated area compared to that of Europe. Now, I wanted to start actually, with an amazing fact. You could say this was a answered prayer story that people might not think of as a typical miracle story on the battlefield or something like that. But it's just a fun one that I want to start with this afternoon. George Washington Carver is an American historical figure that every kid in school has learned or should learn about. Do you know about his popularization of many uses for the peanut as a scientist? Did you know he came up with those ideas in answer to prayer? Here's how he stated it in 1920. Interesting date, 300 years from. Anyway, he says, years ago, I went into my laboratory and said, "Dear Mr. Creator, please tell me what the universe was made for." The great Creator answered, "You want to know too much for that little mind of yours. Ask for something more your size, little man." Then I asked, "Please, Mr. Creator, tell me what man was made for." Again, the Creator replied, "You are still asking too much." So then I asked, "Please, Mr. Creator, will you tell me why the peanut was made?" That's better. But even that's infinite. What do you want to know about the peanut? Mr. Creator, can I make milk out of the peanut? And then the great Creator taught me to take the peanut apart and put it together again, and out of the process have come forth all of these products, peanut-based products, including, he was talking about nut milk all the way back in 1920, huh? If you go to the first, this is another speech he did, he echoed this same theme before the House of Representatives. If you go to the first chapter of Genesis, we can interpret very clearly, I think, what God intended when he said, "Behold, I have given you every herb that bears seed. To you it shall be meat." This is what he means about it. It shall be meat. Don't you appreciate that fundamental approach to the Bible? Like the Bible actually means when it says evening and morning the first day, it was an evening and it was a morning and a day. That's an idea, right? Plant foods shall be your food. It shall be your meat. There is everything there in the plant kingdom to strengthen and nourish and keep the body alive and healthy. That's a pretty radical thing for him to say at that time, right? 100 years ago. The chairman asked, "Dr. Carver, where did you learn all these things?" He answered, "From an old book." The chairman asks, "What book?" Dr. Carver insists, "The Bible." Chairman says, "Does the Bible tell about peanuts?" "No, sir, but it tells about the God who made the peanut. I asked him to show me what to do with the peanut, and he did." So it's an answer to prayer story. The George Washington Carver genius that you learned about in grade school, he attributed to God answering his prayer to give him wisdom on what to do with the peanut. Now we're going to go way back to the 1700s. We're going to work our way through the founding generation with a couple of detours here and there. But you're probably aware that prior to 1776, there was no United States of America as an independent entity. There were 13 colonies, British colonies, and the main rival of the British at that time, do you know, was the Empire of France. So you got the British Empire and the French Empire competing for and carving up North America for their colonial possessions. So our first miracle story comes from before 1776. This is before there was an America as we know it. It's the 1740s. We're in the midst of King George's War between Britain and France. Now, as a part of that war, New France, as it was called at the time, which is modern-day Nova Scotia, New France's main port town, called Louisbourg, falls to the British in 1745. This is the third busiest seaport in North America, next to Boston, of course. The third busiest seaport in North America, in New France, has now been surrendered by the French to the British. So what do you think the French are going to do? Well, we're going to reconquer it. We're going to regroup, and we're going to come with a massive naval force to reconquer Louisbourg the next year. And while we're at it, we're going to go ahead and take Boston. This in Protestant New England. You see prophetic implications when you realize Catholic France here. This is before the French Revolution. Catholic France now attempting to conquer Boston. Not just Louisbourg, but the key here is to come for Protestant British colonies. So the French send 73 ships, 800 cannons, 13,000 troops, and on October 16, 1746, the pastor of the church in Boston, Reverend Thomas Prince, prays the following: "Send thy tempest, Lord, upon the waters. Scatter the ships of our tormentors." That was his prayer. You think prophecy has an interest in, does the God of prophecy have an interest in preserving Boston as a Protestant future state of America and not falling to Catholic France? The earth helped out the woman. Well, you understand that God intervenes in history in marvelous ways to facilitate the fulfillment of prophecy. Now, we want to be careful when we talk about that historically, though, because you could make this out to be British Empire good guys, French Empire bad guys, right? And then all of a sudden, the very British that were persecuting the separatists this morning, we all of a sudden have baptized them as being the army of God like Constantine thought he was doing. So we're not going there, but God does intervene in ways that, according to his providence and prophecy, dictate. So America was to be a haven for the Protestant faith. So what do you think happens after this prayer? The French are on their way with this massive fleet, these hundreds of cannons and thousands of troops, as we just said. Right after this prayer, the sky darkens, the winds shriek, and this hurricane-force wind scatters the French fleet as far as the Caribbean. Lightning strikes, exploding powder kegs and ships, and the French fleet is destroyed. They did not even make landfall. They did not even achieve their objective of recapturing Lewisburg, let alone Boston. So I want to fast forward, though, a couple generations on that topic of windstorms and weather patterns. I told you we'd take some detours, right? So we're still in the 1740s, but while we're on the topic of using weather in this way, 1812. Are you familiar with the War of 1812? This is where the British are trying to recapture the American states for their colonial possessions. These rebels beat us in the Revolutionary War. We're going to go get them. And at that time, there was impressment of British soldiers and British sailors. Actually, Joseph Bates was one of those, if you've ever read his biography. So the British Empire was taking Americans captive, enslaving them, basically, to fight in their imperial wars with France and Napoleon. At this time, America stands up and says, we can't have that. The British says, we're coming after you. So they come and they do land, and they are wreaking havoc on Washington, D.C. Literally, they burned the White House. You know, the White House it was burned in 1812. And beyond that, they were going to other buildings in D.C. They were just destroying everything. And they're a much more powerful military force than these ragtag American states, still in its infancy in the early republic. So they're going to need some help, aren't they? Not by might nor by power. So what does the Lord do? All of a sudden, a great storm and a fierce tornado come upon the British, killing many of the British soldiers. I mean, how often do you see tornadoes that are killing people through Washington, D.C.? It occasionally happens, but right at the moment that this attack is going on, you're thinking, the Lord shall fight for you and you shall hold your peace, right? Again, not to make the American government akin to that of ancient Israel. We've got to be very careful with that, because there's some very erroneous theology out there about how human governments and nations become the government of God, and you enforce God's edicts, and then all of a sudden religious liberty is gone. So we'll get into that theme in a little bit. But God did definitely intervene. The British fled the city. The torrential rains for hours make everything muddy and extinguish the fires that had been lit by the British. The British now have to make it out in their retreat through downed trees, through muddy roads. Their ships have damaged rigging. Some of them had been run aground by the storm. And the British Navy said, well, okay, we'll not assault Washington, D.C. We're really focusing our target on Baltimore right now. They're bombarding the American fort with their cannonballs. 1,800 of them. That's no contest. I mean, the Americans have nothing against that, except the storm that had ravaged the British in D.C. moved to Baltimore and turned everything into mud. And the cannonballs are landing, half of them not exploding because of the soft landing. And that's where we get the National Anthem from. Did you know that? It was that battle right there that the British did not succeed at destroying Baltimore, let alone D.C. And so Francis Scott Key wrote the famous words, and the flag was still there as they held off the British miraculously. Now, back to the period of the mid-1700s. We're going to get up to the War for Independence shortly. But the 7 Years' War in 1755 is yet another British versus French war that's happening globally, really. This is a world war between the two. Wherever they wanted colonial possessions, this war was going on, particularly North America. So this is a 22-year-old British colonel at this time. You may recognize his name. He's a very important figure, George Washington, 22-year-old British colonel, engaged in a battle with the French as a British officer. Now, he was, in this key battle, the only British officer that survived this battle. The British were destroyed. They were flattened by the French. Now, here's what Washington later said about his survival providentially. He says, "I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation. For I had 4 bullets through my coat, and 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions on every side of me." What are the chances you get 4 bullets through the fabric of your coat and none of them hit you? That's just not probable, is it? He called it beyond human expectation. In other words, divine intervention. So again, providence is holding off the French conquest of what would become the United States of America, and preserving the life of a very important founding father who, by the way, if you read the book Gospel Workers, you hear him mentioned in that as somebody who had a character that was admirable in the sense of he was self-disciplined, he did things by system and order, and a hardworking man, basically, is kind of what I take from that quote. I think that's kind of cool to see somebody who's even in the secular world having self-discipline and character that's mentioned in a Spirit of Prophecy book as admirable for us to emulate. By the way, while we're on the topic of bullets being diverted from the body in a miraculous way, a similar story happened to a president of the United States later in American history. Do you know what president that is? Do you know who that is? This is 1830s President Andrew Jackson. An assailant, a would-be assassin, comes at him with not 1 but 2 pistols, both loaded and ready to fire. He attempts to fire one, misfires, attempts to fire the other, both misfire. What are the chances of this, right? And Andrew Jackson said, "A kind of providence has been pleased to shield me against the recent attempt upon my life, and irresistibly carried many mind to the belief in a superintending providence." You know, they believed in a superintending providence, and they're not even necessarily particularly religious in their orientation. Believers in God, but they certainly would give credit where credit was due when the time came. History has definitely provided abundant evidence to back up the assertion that it was not him or any human mechanism that caused those pistols to misfire, because when the Bible prophesies something, God's superintending providences will facilitate that it gets fulfilled. Who's that? Do you know who that is? This is a real war hero, talking about the non-combatancy thing. I really like people like Desmond Doss, people that were medics and would run out into the field of battle. This is Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross. She's a war hero in her own right. She was delivering relief supplies, again, during the Civil War. I'm off the timeline again right now, but while we're on the topic of bullets, check this out. This incredible lady is carrying a wounded soldier from the field of battle, and while doing that, she wrote, "A ball had passed between my body," that's a bullet, "between my body and the right arm, which supported him." So she's carrying somebody here, and the bullet comes at her, but doesn't hit her. It just goes through the soldier that she was saving, cutting through his sleeve and passing through his chest from shoulder to shoulder. "There was no more to be done for him, and I left him to his rest." She understood the state of the dead, didn't she? Or at least she knows how to phrase it. "I have never mended," oh, that's amazing. She says, "I have never mended that hole in my sleeve," because she went on to say, soldiers who give their lives on the battlefield don't get the privilege of mending their garments when they are shot through. So in honor of these sacrificial soldiers, she said, "I'm never going to mend that hole in my sleeve." So again, bullets going through holes, or going through garments, but not hitting the person, whether it's Washington, Andrew Jackson, Clara Barton. Here's another bullets through coats while we're on the topic of bullets through coats, but not hitting people. Back in 1820, remember when I told you about 1620, thank you for that. I appreciate that you guys are willing to do that. Sometimes people are just quiet and everybody's thinking it, but nobody says it. Nobody gives me a chance to correct it. But Miles Standish, the defense, the soldier that the Pilgrims had hired, he's taken them out on this expedition. Well, at one point, there was an assault of Indian fire. They were firing their bows, their arrows at them from the forest. And what happened here, according to William Bradford's account, he says the arrows were coming at them from all directions, but by the special providence of God, none of them either hit or hurt us. Though many came close by us, and some coats which hung upon our barricade were shot through and through. So they had coats hanging up here. Those are getting shot through, the coats. So God likes to get our attention with garments getting wounded, but people being preserved. I love these missionaries, or these miracle stories. But you know, even better ones are the missionary miracle stories. You like mission stories? I mean, so many times the people who are on the front lines of winning souls and doing the mission work of God. We're kind of looking more at secular history here, but it's providential history as well. Not in the same sense as missionaries, but you got the idea. Back to George Washington. That was quite a detour on all over the time frame, but when we talk about bullets through garments, we got to hit a few, and when we talk about weather events. But now let's walk more systematically through the history here. George Washington and the War for Independence. Here we are, 1775 and on. You get a cluster of miracle stories during this period of the essential founding of America. So here you have the first naval engagement of the War for Independence. It's the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. Here you have the British Navy. Now, when you hear the words the British Navy, you're thinking the most powerful navy in the world at this time. They defeated the Spanish Armada. Everything was history there. The British are number one. Now you've got a ragtag group of Continental Army soldiers on the land. No contest, right, for the strongest military power on the globe, the British Empire. Historians like to say, well, what happened here at Bunker Hill was quite a coincidence for the colonists, quite a fortunate coincidence that in this important opening battle, the British ships happened to be stocked with the wrong size cannonballs for their cannon. And they could not bombard the American position or the city of Boston with their cannon fire as they had hoped to. So 2,300 British soldiers have to disembark. Remember, they're the powerful naval force. They're now not as much at an advantage when they're having to land. And they suffered twice as many casualties as the Americans in that land battle that took place. That was supposed to be a naval annihilation. Another time in the war, the British held siege against the colonists at Boston. Siege meaning starving them out. Nothing's going in, nothing's going out, and we're going to starve you into submission. British General Howe said, okay, we're going to plan now 3,000 troops to go finish them off. They're going to charge Dorchester Heights, was the hill there. Before he could do it, though, just like happened in the War of 1812, a generation later, a violent storm caused turbulent seas and prevented the landing of these 3,000 troops. General Washington put it this way, that this most remarkable interposition of providence is for some wise purpose, I have not a doubt. He didn't know Revelation 12 like we do, but you know it was for some wise purpose that God had the earth help the woman to create a land of religious freedom from where would flow the truth and the remnant church of Bible prophecy. So that's pretty neat. New York was the next target for the British. The British planned they said, okay, we're not holding back anymore. The largest land invasion force in history, we're just going to, 32,000 troops on 400 ships, we're going to go through and just take over these people. Enough of this. Well, you can imagine New York Harbor filled with hundreds of masts like tree trunks of these. I mean, that's pretty intimidating with the British Navy coming upon you like that. Even George Washington said, we are not, in men or in arms, prepared for it. That was his statement, facing the fact we don't have what it takes here. But you know what the rest of his quotation says? Providence will still go on to afford us aid. So he trusted and understood there was a divine guiding hand. The date is July 9, 1776. Does that sound close to another date you know in history? July 9, 1776 is 5 days after the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. And the Declaration of Independence is brought to the Continental Army at New York. And a copy is read. It's brought from Philadelphia where it had been signed. And the inspiration that they received from that document included these words, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. We mutually pledged to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They understood providence was guiding this war, this independence struggle. Now, again, that doesn't mean the Continental Army is the army of God. God's covenant in the New Testament is a covenant with the church. It's not a covenant with a nation in the same sense. So America is not modern Israel. I just want to repeat that because I don't want to go Constantinian on you here. And sometimes we might draw that idea out of this history, if otherwise not stated as a disclaimer a few times. However, when God says that it's going to happen in prophecy, it's going to happen. And he's going to involve himself in nations and even military battles to guide things according to his providence. It says in the Declaration of Independence, by the way, do you know that the Great Controversy, the book The Great Controversy, refers to the Declaration of Independence as that grand old document? You ever read that phrase in there? Oh, one of the best chapters in the whole book is the one on the Pilgrim Fathers, and then it includes this about the American founding, 1776. And that is the most famous and inspiring articulation of the equality, unalienable rights of the human person, and that all men are created equal. The best thing ever written, most cited on the topic outside of the Bible. And so that fact alone makes it relevant and makes it believable that it was providence that was guiding in the aims of this struggle against the British Empire. 10,000 British troops then are landed elsewhere. They come from behind to trap the Continental Army between that force of 10,000 and the sea where their naval force is. So now the colonists, all they can do is retreat. I mean, they're trapped here. They know they're coming. They know they're here. There's nowhere to go. We got to get across the East River. This is New York. And interestingly, providentially, the waters of the East River at this point, when they need to stage their retreat, are notably calm. And this is known as the Miraculous retreat across the East River by night because you can't be detected. So, interestingly, though, where the British ships are, the waters are especially boisterous once again. So half of Washington's forces are able to get through at night. And you might say, well, that does not sound like a miraculous retreat. Half of them are going to get slaughtered or taken prisoners of war and starve. Well, here's the miracle. Only half of them made it out under the cover of darkness at night. The other half remain and are nervous as the sun is rising, but they notice a mysterious, thick fog that has rested upon the morning atmosphere. A fog that detects them, or that conceals them just as well as the dark of night did. So they they continue their retreat. Every single Continental Army soldier retreats safely without detection by the British. Ben Talmadge, the chief of intelligence of George Washington's army, said, "A very dense fog seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance." That means I wouldn't be able to see most of you guys, right? That's pretty cool. Oh, by the way, another dense fog story, 1812, the War of 1812. Before he was President Jackson, he was Colonel Jackson in the American Army against the British there. And it was a dense fog that this time mysteriously lifted to allow for the American assault on the British to win the victory in that very famous pivotal battle, the Battle of New Orleans, that turned the tide of the War of 1812. Jackson said, "It appears that the unerring hand of Providence shielded my men from the shower of balls, bombs, and rockets, while every ball and bomb from our guns carried with them a mission of death." You know, these guys aren't usually like the most humble people around. They could take the opportunity to say, greatest military commander ever, right? Like, check out what we did, and just go boast about their exploits. But they keep giving credit to God because it's so miraculous and so evident that it wasn't mere human genius that did these things. Well, the British gave up on the War of 1812. Not only because of that battle, but because Napoleon was gaining the advantage in Europe, and they needed to abandon their, if you will, their western front and go on to the mainland Europe. But back to the War for Independence. The turning point of the war has been, as it's been called, is the Battle of Saratoga, where the Americans gained the if you will, the turning point against the British in the war. Now, the British lost 6,000 of their soldiers and surrendered in that battle. And you might say, how and why is the superior military continuing to lose and be evaded and being, in this case, actually defeated? Elihu Yale stated it this way, a contemporary. He said, "To whom but the ruler of the winds shall we ascribe it? That, here's how they lost the Battle of Saratoga, that the British reinforcement in the summer of 1777 was delayed on the ocean 3 months by contrary winds until it was too late. So George Washington called that a signal stroke of providence. That turning point in the war was a turning point because at this point, the French get involved on the American side, and now there's a naval force and an army to give aid to the American Continental Army. Without the French, Americans probably never would have beaten the British in the Revolutionary War. Now, you just have to pause sometimes, by the way, as you think back to the issue, the event called the Valley Forge Winter. This is 11,000 soldiers in December in the freezing conditions. Literally 2,500 Americans froze to death. They had black limbs. They had amputated limbs. And these were Americans from every state. And these states didn't all see eye to eye. They viewed themselves very, very differently, one state versus another, at least one region of the colonies versus another. But they were united in the appeal for independence and liberty as it was articulated in the Declaration of Independence. You've got children as young as 12 participating in this because they were so hard up for soldiers. You've got 60-year-old men. Actually, men as young as 12 years old. Can I say that? Because we know that in the Bible, the age 12 is where childhood ends and youth begins. But the moment a youth of age 12 is on the battlefield and participating at this level, side by side with men, I call that a young man, not a kid. But this included, there were African-American soldiers on the side of the Americans here, Native Americans. It was unity. And you just have to pause sometimes and be thankful to those who have sacrificed so much. Those brave Americans that sacrificed their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, right, for liberty that we enjoy. We owe them a debt of gratitude. 12,400 Americans at one point were put on British starving ships. And you might think, what? I've never heard of a starving ship. Well, that's what it is. They literally would just imprison thousands of Americans, 12,400 Americans, on these ships with no food or water until they starved to death. 11,000 Americans died just being starved to death. That's a 90% casualty rate. 12,400 of them, 11,000 die. That's more than twice as many American soldiers died in the whole war, in battle. So you had, about 5,000 Americans die in battle. 11,000 died on the starving ships. At Valley Forge, another 2,500 died of freezing to death. So it was really a brutal time for these people to go through. So just thinking really what that means for us and how grateful you feel to have peace, prosperity, and liberty. The final act and defeat in the American Revolution was the Battle of Cowpens, and most notably, the pursuit of the Americans that followed. So the Americans gained the advantage in the battle, but then did their retreat. And it was the retreat that was particularly interesting because General Cornwallis of the British pursues the Continental Army right after the battle, and they're some distance behind, perhaps 2 hours distance is estimated. Now the Americans cross the Catawba River, at which point, on cue, as you would expect, a sudden storm causes the Catawba to rise substantially and delays the British pursuit further. You're starting to expect these things now, aren't you? You're like, yeah, I'm not surprised. That's how this history goes. So now they're further behind. But get this, there's another river the Americans cross, the Dan River. Same thing happens. After the Americans cross, the rain comes down, the floods come up, a flash flood blocks the British pursuit again. 2 in a row. That's pretty awesome. British Commander Henry Clinton admitted, this is a British commander, here the Royal Army was again stopped by a sudden rise of the waters, which had only just fallen, almost miraculously, to let the enemy over. I think you can remove the word almost from there, but he got the idea, didn't he? So in summing that all up, this period, George Washington said, this is the whole war. We have abundant reasons to thank Providence for its many favorable interpositions in our behalf. It has at times been my only dependence, for all other resources seemed to have failed us. Now, so far we've heard a lot about God having the destiny of this nation in his hands, right? To borrow from Testimonies Volume 1. We also know that America goes rogue in the last days in Revelation 13, that it speaks like a dragon. So when we go in that direction, does that mean all is lost? No, our hope was in a nation all along. No. our hope is in a better country and heavenly, right? And so while we can appreciate and love and be patriotic and really embrace the principles of America, know that our hope lies beyond that. And the only reason that the American history and principles have value to us is not because of some tribal identity or anything of that nature. It's simply because of those principles reflect the principles of heaven, liberty, Protestantism, etc. It's important to make clear when people hear the lamb-like nation in Revelation 13, and we say the phrase, America is one, you know the phrase, one nation under God, indivisible with liberty and justice for all, from the Pledge of Allegiance. And on the money, it says, in God we trust. We're going to have to walk a tightrope on this, because there are two equally dangerous and insidious pits of civic philosophy that the world has been subjected to. And the beauty of the American Republic is that it walks this line. And so I want to walk through some of those ideas and sort of the ideologies of the world. And it begins by, I'll just, it bears repeating that when we look at a nation and its government and its military, that is not the equivalent of the Church of God. The kingdom of God is an entity that is transnational. It's just all humans who embrace the gospel of Jesus Christ, particularly the present truth in the last days. A nation, a government, as a total society will never equate to that. You can have proportions that rise, and that's our hope and desire, and we do that through evangelism. But simply put, we are never called as Christians to lord it over our fellow men, to rule over them. Jesus put it this way. He said to himself, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. So you hear the pagans, the Gentiles, the heathen, those are the ones that seek power over others. This was the big mistake of Constantine that I mentioned a few times. If you don't know the story of Constantine, it's the 300s AD, and up till that point, Christianity had been comprised of people voluntarily associating in the Church of God, worshiping together, and they never sought imperial domination over others. But Constantine comes along, and for many reasons, he says, we're now going to wed the church and the state, and the military is going to be one Christian conquering force. He claims to have seen a vision of the sign of the cross, and it said, in this sign you shall conquer. Now, is that what Jesus said? Is that what Christianity is about? Conquering other people and converting at the point of a sword? Not so. Not at all. So Constantine's theology actually gets picked up in modern times, and there's a school of thought called dominion theology. If you've never heard of this, it's something to be clued into. The dominion theology idea is we're going to take America back for God using legislative power, government force, and we're going to conquer people's soul with the power and the structures of governmental authority. That's what Jesus warned us not to do. And so that's a major stream of theology, really, in the last 60, 70 years that came out in America. It's repugnant to the reader of the New Testament. So what makes America different then? What makes America exceptional and distinct? Well, the tightrope here is that the American system is a system that neither denies God nor enforces God. Did you follow that? This is key. This is crucial. It's a system that neither denies God nor enforces God. Let's look at the two polar opposites that the devil presents. You know how that's how the devil usually works? He doesn't just promote one contrary idea. He promotes several so that you can choose your poison. You know what I mean? And they'll be opposites. So if one is bad, the other is good. No, that one's bad. That makes this one good. We got to have clarity and discernment to think and walk this tightrope. The American system of liberty that our founding fathers gave to us as led by the providence of God doesn't reach into either of these poles. Okay, what are the poles? You know about the Dark Ages, papal Rome. This is where church and state are wedded. It's the grandchild of the Constantinian idea of we will enforce Christianity. And at that point, it's not Christianity because you can't force that. True Christianity can't be coerced, can it? Because it's a free choice to love God, and love cannot be forced. So the papal system, which was adopted in some Protestant settings as well, so-called Protestant settings, as we saw this morning with the Church of England, that's counterfeit number one. Then you get on down in the history, and you come to, let's see, here we're gonna talk about the French Revolution and the Marxist revolutions of the 1800s. Okay, communism, socialism, and the French Revolution. This counterfeit said, well, religion is a persecuting thing. Churches are bad because they acquire political power and rule over others and engage in massacres and destruction and crusades and inquisitions. So we need to cast off all religion. We need to have, religion is the opiate of the masses, said Karl Marx. We want a purely secular society. The French Revolution is the most famous of that, as we're going to look at in just a second. But socialist governments deny God altogether, and that's a religion in and of itself. Karl Marx taught a meta-narrative, if you will. He taught a ideological framework that was looked at through the lenses of class struggle. The proletariat, the good guys, the bourgeoisie, the bad guys. The class struggle to overthrow the owners of capital is redemption. So it's just another religion, really, without a God. It's a godless religion. It's an atheistic ideology that mirrors all the aspects of religion. Same thing today, by the way. We have the descendants of Marxism in our world today. It's usually not referred to as class struggle and Marxism in the traditional sense, but it's cultural Marxism. It's you divide along other lines than class. You divide people along gender, along race, along orientations and such. And that is a way to divide society of the villains versus the virtuous. And then you can achieve the same goals of acquiring power, which is what the communist ideology has always done. So whether it's Marxism, socialism, communism, or cultural Marxism, these secular ideologies are going to lead to the same result. And by the way, they don't always sound secular. The devil's so clever. Did you know that there are so-called Christian Catholic apologists who dip into this and call it liberation theology? Are you familiar with that term? It has mostly Latin American connotations where the Romanism was very prominent. But it's basically taking Marxism and wearing it as a Christian, putting a Christian cloak over it. So I don't know which side of these you'd put that on, but it's a combination of both to look at the liberation theology. But the bottom line is this is going to be viciously, violently, vociferously opposed to Bible-believing Christianity. It's going to annihilate religious liberty, just like this one did. So we've got to be careful. Some people look at this and they go, enforcement of religion, church and state wedded, we should just get rid of all religion together and that will bring freedom. Not so. How did it work in France? Did it work well in France? This was a revolution that was absolutely destructive to life and liberty in France. It ushered in the reign of terror. It ushered in the guillotine and mass slaughter and executions indiscriminately. It eventually facilitated Napoleonic France in its wake, dictatorship and conquest once again. So it's secular and it's supposedly liberating, but it's military conquest of Europe nonetheless. Death, destruction, and no freedom. Now that's not to say that the powers that be in France that were overthrown by the French Revolution were good. I mean, you had Catholic France, you had monarchy there, and so that's how the devil pits the two against each other. We'll make a really, really, really bad France. You know, John Calvin's there trying to get the Protestant Reformation going. He's kicked out. The Huguenots are persecuted. They flee, and Romanism dominates France. So, problem, reaction, solution. Let's overthrow religion altogether, says secular revolution, French Revolution ideology. You could say the Dark Ages was actually the catalyst for the French Revolution and the atheistic ideologies that followed in its wake. Because oppressive religious power, ruling by the sword for centuries, is going to get people pretty upset. And you're going to end up with revolutionary forces that did come to the fore, overthrowing monarchy and etc. But during the time of the Dark Ages, you're aware of the fact that Bible-believing Christianity did exist, right? The earth was in the wilderness, so to speak, for 1,260 years. You had the Waldenses, you had Wycliffe and Huss, and you had the translation of the Bible into the English language. You have these pre-reformatory movements, and then the big one, 1517, we just celebrated the 500th anniversary of that 5 years ago, Martin Luther's Germany, followed by Switzerland, the Netherlands, the Scandinavian countries, all of them. But France rejected the Reformation. Germany accepted it. Switzerland accepted it. The Netherlands, the Scandinavian countries, all accepted the Reformation, but France dug in their heels and they said, no, not here. And John Calvin had to end up setting up shop in Geneva, in Switzerland. Well, the Protestants who did remain in France, they were called the Huguenots, I mentioned. By the way, this is kind of an interesting fun fact. I told you I had Dutch heritage, so my lineage, my blood is from the Netherlands. But actually, where did the Huguenots flee to when they left France? Was the Netherlands. So actually, some of my lineage is French, even though no French heritage is there at all. It's all Dutch culture, but some of that blood lineage is Huguenots moving to the Netherlands and intermarrying there. But the Protestants who did remain in France, who did not succeed in fleeing, you know what happened to them. It was annihilation time. Events like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where tens of thousands of Bible-believing Christians were slaughtered by the powers that be in papal France. Which kind of solidified the reputation of papal Rome and monarchies across Europe as being bloodthirsty and ruthless forces across this continent. Christianity that attempts to rule by the sword and enforces religious dogma is not Christian. It is anti-Christ. So the French Revolution looks at that and says, well, that's terrible. But then they throw the baby out with the bathwater, don't they? They say no religion at all. Religion itself is bad and inherently violent and oppressive. Well, no, it's not. Jesus quoted, and he taught, and we quoted, that we are not to lord it over our fellow man. That is not the gospel. But they couldn't see, or they refused to see, past the particular version or flavor of Christianity that had so persecuted them for so many centuries, a entity that the Bible calls Antichrist, not Christian. So anyway, lesson learned, Satan is a master of having two equal opposites, both of which are equally evil. Pick between papal dominion and atheistic mass murder. I didn't mention the mass murder of the Bastille Day in the French Revolution. This is celebrated as the day that they were liberated from the monarchy and from the priest class of France, but it's a mass uprising where they didn't simply overthrow oppressive religion or oppressive political forces. They sought to de-Christianize the nation of France altogether. Because something is going to be supreme, so what is supreme? Well, what do they elevate as their God, their North Star? They said, well, religion is full of superstitions, and we are in the age of enlightenment, and so we human beings can, through our limited human minds, achieve supremacy of intellectual greatness. So our goddess is reason. Reason, they literally made her their goddess, which you might say, that sounds religious. It's kind of hard to escape all the religious trappings. They made temples of reason. Literally, the Notre Dame Cathedral was seized and converted into a temple of reason, as were other churches. And then you get to the reign of terror. Because when you cast off God, when you cast off moral restraint, when you cast off his law, you get bloodshed. It's just inevitable like night follows day. Robespierre's reign of terror, one of the lowlights in human history, where they had Voltaire, the rights of man. I'm sorry, that was Thomas Paine, but they would talk about libertas, right, and liberty and the rights of man. This was the most neglecting of human rights moment in generations at this time. Anybody who was suspected of potentially harboring any sympathies for the monarchy or for the church was promptly decapitated by the guillotine. And they called it, interestingly, maybe you remember this from your history books of the French Revolution, his reign of terror is what we call it correctly. He called it Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety. Public safety. Now, that's good PR, isn't it? Do we sometimes in our day hear phrases and names given to things where you're like, I think there's something more going on than that. That's the PR overlay you give to your whatever you might want to call it. This is one of the darkest moments in human history, public safety, but, public health. How about that phrase? Homeland security, or whatever name you might be given to violations of human rights, civil and religious liberties, and death that ensues. So anyway, papal dominion is the opposite of the American Protestant Republic. Socialistic or atheistic, French Revolution style or Marxist secular dominion is also the opposite of the American Republic. Listen to this from the Great Controversy. It says, in that grand old document, which our forefathers set forth as their Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, they declared, We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Did you notice? There is a creator. It says they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable, meaning can't be taken away, rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Does that sound like French Revolution? Does that sound like Papal Rome? Does that sound like Marxism and communism? Not at all. This is a principle that walked that fine line, that doesn't deny God, because where else would we get our rights from if not from God? If there is no creator, if we all just evolved, then there is no absolute moral framework to declare taking of human life to be wrong. Where did you get the idea of wrong from? So postmodern philosophy ensues, and there is no right and wrong. There's my truth and your truth, his truth and her truth. But in a place where the law is king, that was written in the Latin by Rutherford, Samuel Rutherford, prior to the Declaration of Independence. He wrote the book Lex Rex. The law is king. So we don't have a monarchy. We don't have arbitrary rule. We have the rule of law, where the law is king. But what is that law based upon? If there's not the last 6 commandments declaring that stealing and murder is wrong, absolutely, because we are human beings endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, then what law? It's just a social construct. Whatever the opinion of your society is and whatever our preferences and moral values are, we'll establish those, and there is no foundation anymore. But in the American Republic, there was to be. It doesn't deny God, and it doesn't enforce God. You remember that slide from earlier? That's key. It doesn't deny God, and it doesn't enforce God. This authoritarian secularist state is God in this situation, and over here, the Pope is God. And so in both situations, you've got a human entity that has taken the place of God, and you don't have liberty. Here you have no church-state enforcement of religion, but you also don't outlaw religion. That's in the First Amendment. Did you know the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibit the free exercise thereof. These guys prohibit free exercise also, but it's both. They're both there. We're neither going to enforce religion nor prohibit religion from being exercised. That's a self-evident truth. It is an unalienable right that cannot be taken away. So the American Republic, founded by Protestants, acknowledges the Creator, doesn't enforce religion, doesn't restrict religion, freedom of conscience. So is it any surprise then? This is the earth helped the woman. This is Bible prophecy. It was from America, not France, not Rome, from America where these principles were laid down that became the wellspring of 19th century missionary work in Bible societies and the great Second Advent awakening, as we've referenced a number of times, verse 17 of Revelation 12. And here is the remnant of her seed with the truth, with the commandments and the testimony of Jesus. That is beautiful. By the way, that's the only time all day I've got something highlighted in yellow. I know that's obnoxious to look at too frequently, but is that not important? In this case, it gets a yellow highlighting because this was all God's movement to bring truth to all people of all nations. Now, this toleration of minority religions actually was not invented by America's founding fathers. Well, you may be like, well, of course, we just heard Jesus say to not lord it over people like the Gentiles do. So, but I mean, in the Protestant era, coming out of the Dark Ages, there were groups like the Anabaptists in the 1500s who taught and practiced, we will not take up the sword to enforce religion. We do not want the church and the state to be united. They baptized believers, by the way. That's why they were called Anabaptists or rebaptizers. They called for the complete separation of church and state and for Christians to put their sword back in its place. In the Netherlands, I've mentioned, of course, that was a free place that the Pilgrims fled to in 1620. The period of their most tolerant society was called the Dutch Golden Age. They also had the most flourishing of art and prosperity and literature during that time because people were free. It was a free place, and they gave permission for English separatists and any others who, within reason, would come and exercise their religion freely. In America, it was not 1776 that it started that you have religious toleration. In Pennsylvania, from very early on in the 1600s, William Penn, a Quaker, said religious toleration, complete religious freedom in Pennsylvania. You can even be Jewish. You can be whatever you want in Pennsylvania, and we're not going to prohibit the free exercise of religion, nor will we establish a religion. Oh, my favorite of all, Roger Williams of Rhode Island. That was another free society that predated and preceded the American founding. He you might say, was the most enlightened, the most progressive of all of them. He taught that the state has no business regulating the first 4 commandments of God. That's a true expression of Protestantism, isn't it? Worship is something that is freely offered to God. It cannot be coerced. He said the state has no business on the first 4. Murder, theft, marriage contracts, lying under oath, and enforcing of business contracts, all of that is part of the state's role. Interestingly, by the way, side note, this is not in my notes, and I didn't plan on this one. Didn't say this one at Amazing Facts. It didn't come to my mind right now. One of the things, when I'm talking about the last 6 commandments here, one of the things I threw in there was marriage contracts. It says in the Great Controversy that one of the things that France got wrong was they diminished marriage to be simply a civil union. So that's some food for thought when you think about the Supreme Court decision from 2015, the LGBTQIA agenda. But this is a true expression of Protestantism. I love it. The first 4 commandments, no business there. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor the prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And that's what the Constitution said. But before the Constitution, you got to look at, I left one off, didn't I? Who did I leave off? The Anabaptists, okay, the Netherlands, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island. Who did I leave off? I'll give you a hint. We spent over an hour on them this morning, right? The Pilgrims, the Mayflower Compact, 1620. And you might say, no, wait a minute, I know about New England. I know that they weren't the most religiously tolerant folks around. You're thinking of Massachusetts Bay. Plymouth Colony, when they established their Mayflower Compact, this was a forerunner to the Declaration of Independence. This was people, a group of people, not by any authority of popes or kings, simply gathering themselves in what they called their own civil body politic. Just a society organized by people, for people, and of the people, as the U.S. Constitution says, we the people, right? These guys blazed the trail for what would later become the Constitution. And in the Mayflower Compact, believers and unbelievers were equal before the law. Do you realize how revolutionary that was? Massachusetts didn't do that. Most of the colonies didn't do that until after the American Revolution. Believers and unbelievers were equal before the law. John Robinson, their pastor back in the Netherlands who sent them off and then they came here, he said, if you encounter people who are of a different faith, different viewpoint, different beliefs, you must exercise tolerance of those whom you disagree with. Now, I mentioned there were some American colonies that were not quite like that, right? They weren't like Plymouth and Pennsylvania and Rhode Island. Virginia, for example, was an Anglican colony. It was Church of England, although when it became an American colony, separated from the British, it wouldn't be Church of England anymore. They became Episcopal, but nonetheless not enforced anymore according to the First Amendment. Maryland was a Catholic colony. And some of the strongest enforcers of their own so-called Protestant religion was actually the Puritans, the cousins of the separatists in Massachusetts Bay. And you read about this in the Great Controversy. They sought freedom from persecution in Europe and ended up coming here and persecuting people who did not agree with their doctrines. And that's why I draw this very strong distinction here between Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Puritans, versus, Plymouth Colony, the separatists. The separatists were the ones we studied this morning, the Pilgrims. They didn't do what these guys did when Roger Williams, interestingly, Roger Williams founded Rhode Island because he was banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony. A lady was banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony named Anne Hutchinson. So for all their virtues, and I know I haven't mentioned any of their virtues, so I haven't been very fair to the Puritans this afternoon or this morning. So they had many virtues. You read about them in the Great Controversy. And so for all their virtues, though, they had an established church state with citizenship tied to church membership. You weren't a member of the church, you're not a citizen. They later on established the halfway covenant and did some maneuvering with that, but they banished these people. These were the ones where the Salem witch trials were held. So some of the darker periods that we use proverbially in our day, it's a checkered past, at least, for the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay, where the persecuted became, to a certain extent, the persecutors. And that's not all they were, but that's a big black mark on Massachusetts Bay. But the Founding Fathers, who wrote our Constitution, did not take their cues from Massachusetts Bay. They did not take their cues from the Puritans. Where did they take it from? Roger Williams, from Pennsylvania, from those old pilgrims. So the Constitution in 1787 was written to walk that line that we've been talking about for some time. Now, I want to share a couple more miracles with you. Have you ever heard of the book, The Miracle at Philadelphia? The idea that the Constitution was actually ratified and came into being and we formed a country is a miraculous thing in and of itself. Listen to George Washington's statement about it. He said, "It appears to me then, little short of a miracle, that the delegates from so many different states, which states you know are also different from each other in their manners, circumstances, and prejudices, would unite in forming a system of national government so little liable to well-founded objections." He says it's nothing short of a miracle. It's little short of a miracle that these states actually agreed and formed a more perfect union. Here's James Madison's statement. He's called the father of the Constitution because he took extensive notes there at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention of 1787. He says, "The real wonder is that so many difficulties should have been surmounted, and surmounted with unanimity, almost as unprecedented as it must have been unexpected. It is impossible for any man of candor to reflect on this circumstance without partaking of the astonishment. It is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in it a finger of the almighty hand, which has been so frequently and signally extended to our relief in the critical stages of the Revolution." They all understood Providence had been involved in the Revolutionary War, but James Madison is saying, you guys realize that the same hand of Providence that gave us that victory, those miracles against the British, that same hand was involved with making this actually happen. I mean, they had to have a bunch of compromises. You remember learning that in middle school in civics class or whatever? The Great Compromise and all these different compromises about a bicameral legislature and how to count population when you got slave states who are a part of the Union and they want their slave population to count. And you're like, wait, they're not citizens. They don't have freedom. How does their slave population count? Well, they just wanted more representation in the House of Representatives. So it was kind of a fraudulent claim to begin with. But then the North, who's like, well, those are people. They're like, well, we don't want your slave population to count because we want you to have less representation in the House of Representatives. So they came up with a 3/5 compromise. 3/5 of the slave population will count for your population for representation in the House of Representatives. Abominable. By the way, some people have said erroneously that at the time of the founding generation, they counted a black person as 3/5 of a person. That's not correct. It's worse. The southern states counted them not as a person at all. And so they had no rights whatsoever. So 3/5 of the person actually exaggerates the issue. Up north, in the free states, they had citizenship and freedom, but in those southern states, not so. Now, that's my last slide on that, but I thought I had something on the Civil War. I do. Last thing, you guys thinking of your questions? Because we can chat, we can talk as soon as we're done here, if you'd like to. I just had these slides hidden because I had to abbreviate this for the amazing facts because they got me on the clock. Oh, yes, thank you for doing that. Thank you for doing that. Okay, I'll do the Civil War thing in a second, because right while I'm thinking about it, 1617, this is so fun. Okay, so I'm studying. I'm going to pull up the morning's presentation and pull up that slide that I skipped. I'm studying through the Pilgrims. They're in the Netherlands in 1617, right? And then they make a decision. So they were there from like 1608 to 1620. In 1617, they made the decision to prepare for departing from the Netherlands to come to America. Do you remember that? I'm Control F, 1617. That's how I'll find this. There it is. Okay. Here, I'm going to put that up so you can get the visual image again. Start from the beginning is F5. Is it just Shift F5 now? Yes. All right. Praise God. With my new keyboard shortcuts, I don't have them figured out yet because my keyboard decided to change its methods on me. So here we are in the Netherlands again in 1617. The Pilgrims have fled England. They're worshiping there freely. They're trying to do mission work. It's not really getting along. Their printing press is getting seized. And William Brewster is back in England laying plans, and then he brings it back, and the people make the decision. And they say, when God's providential finger is pointing them across the Atlantic, they say, we will go. That was from the Great Controversy, right? Now, 1617 was an interesting year that they felt led to make that decision. Because remember I mentioned that at one point there were arrows coming in from the woods and hostile Indian tribes that were not pleased about any people around, and they were going to kill them. They're invaders. They're bad. The Wampanoags, they were able to forge that friendship and have a positive relationship, but not all the tribes in the area felt that way. Not all of them were that objective toward these pilgrims. They said these are conquerors. These are bad people. Warlike tribes that are more into kind of the violent dominion you sometimes hear about the European colonists versus Indian wars and the horrible, horrific things that you don't want to mention. My brain is going to places of things you don't want to say out loud. You know what I mean? Just the gruesome nature of human conquest and violence. So there was a warlike tribe there in New England. And tragically, they experienced a plague that wiped out the entire tribe. These were the ones on the very land that the pilgrims would come and visit, and God would place them right there in Provincetown Harbor. They would come, they would find the springs, they would find the corn, and they found cleared lands ready for planting. I mean, it takes something to clear land and prepare it for planting, right? The tribe that had been decimated had been right there, and all the area tribes wanted hands off of that because of superstitions about that's where the plague was. So the warlike tribe is gone. The area is cleared and ready for possession where the earth helps out the woman. And that very same year is when they feel impressed by God. Now is the time to go. What if they would have gone 2 years earlier? They would have been annihilated by that warlike tribe. By the way, Squanto was a member of that warlike tribe. So you don't do stereotyping of everybody in that tribe was all evil, because he was the one that was converted to Christianity and became the best friend of the Pilgrims. Okay, so we're not trying to be hard on that tribe, like they needed to be annihilated and God got them. That's not the idea. That happened to be the year that plague happened, and then the Pilgrims were impressed. Now's the time. So I found that to be absolutely fascinating, that was when they felt led by God. It was when the earth became the earth. I mean, it wasn't sparsely populated in 1616. There was a warlike tribe there who would have, Okay, so next thing on the Civil War, and then we're done. Are you guys thinking of your questions? Because we could talk about anything religious liberty related. It's Religious Liberty Weekend, so any of this history or anything you want to talk about. All right, last fun thing about providence in history is in the Civil War. This is from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1, page 264. And the reason I share this with you is not only because it's another awesome example, but because it's from inspired source here. Because some would object to the way that we've done history today in identifying providence. I remember in my academic training, they would scoff at that. They'd be like, providential history, oh, you Christians, and you're jumping to conclusions about things. We only go on evidence. And, well, wait a minute, isn't there plenty of evidence for all these crazy coincidences, not just being coincidences, because there's so many of them, and they're so improbable? So you look at it objectively, and you draw conclusions about providence, like the Founding Fathers did, who, again, were not like, second grade awakening Baptists, Methodists, religious revivalists. They were largely secular people with a belief in God, but they weren't out there necessarily trying to proclaim an everlasting gospel and using this as an opportunity to give providence and glory to God. They were just being objective. This is God's providence, because they couldn't deny it. But nonetheless, you're not supposed to do that. If any of you ever have studied history in academia, this is like sin number one, is don't try to do providential history. And I learned that from Christian historians, interestingly. That's shameful, but I've since gone back and revised how we do history, because when you study the Bible and you study Spirit of Prophecy, you go, oh, yeah, it is his story. It's all providence. Why would a Christian not want to see the hand of a providential God involved in history? It's strange to me. I think it's to seek acceptance from the secular, historians of the same profession, so we can get published and we can be recognized and respected by them. But I don't care at all about that. I want to witness. I don't want to try to fit in to their ideology. So you want to win them to the truth. Anyway, that's the main reason I wanted to show you this is how you do history too. It's providential history from an inspired source. But here is the cool example. So it says, God is punishing this nation for the high crime of slavery. This is when the Civil War had started. He has, this is where I got that quote from, he has the destiny of the nation in his hands. He will punish the South for the sin of slavery and the North for so long suffering its overreaching and overbearing influence. So then you're going to see in vision what Sister White was shown, Ellen G. White was shown about this battle that took place at the beginning of the Civil War. At the conference at Roosevelt, New York, August 3, 1861, when the brethren and sisters were assembled on the day set apart for humiliation, fasting, and prayer, the Spirit of the Lord rested upon us, and I was taken off in vision and shown the sin of slavery, which has so long been a curse to this nation. The North and the South were presented before me. The North has been deceived in regard to the South. They are better prepared for war than has been represented. The South is. Most of their men are well skilled in the use of arms, some of them from experience in battle, others from habitual sporting. They have the advantage of the North in this respect, but have not, as a general thing, the valor and the power of endurance that Northern men have. I had a view of the disastrous battle at Manassas, Virginia. Now, you'll read the historical accounts of the battle at Manassas, Virginia, and it's a mystery. Like, whoa, what happened there? We're going to get the answer to what happened. It was a most exciting, distressing scene. The Southern Army had everything in their favor and were prepared for a dreadful contest. The Northern Army was moving on with triumph, not doubting but that they would be victorious. Many were reckless and marched forward boastingly as though victory were already theirs. As they neared the battlefield, many were almost fainting through weariness and want of refreshment. They did not expect so fierce an encounter. They rushed into battle and fought bravely, desperately. The dead and dying were on every side. Both the North and the South suffered severely. The Southern men felt the battle, and in a little while would have been driven back still further. Excuse me. The Northern men were rushing on, although their destruction was very great. Just then, an angel descended and waved his hand backward. Did you hear that? An actual angel appeared on the battlefield and moved events. Instantly, there was confusion in the ranks. It appeared to the Northern men that their troops were retreating when it was not so in reality, and a precipitate retreat commenced. This seemed wonderful to me. Then it was explained that God has this nation in his own hand and would not suffer victories to be gained faster than he ordained, and would permit no more losses to the Northern men than in his wisdom he saw it fit to punish them for their sins. And had the Northern Army at this time pushed the battle still further in their fainting, exhausted condition, the far greater struggle and destruction which awaited them would have caused great triumph in the South. So God allowed the North to suffer a lot in that battle, but not as much as they could have. God would not permit this and sent an angel to interfere. God would not permit the great triumph in the South and the victory for the South. The sudden falling back of the Northern troops is a mystery to all. They know not that God's hand was in the matter. Hey, that's a phrase we could apply to everything we've studied in this historical lesson this afternoon and this morning. God's hand was in the matter. And we have nothing to fear, lest we forget how he has led us, and his hand has been in the matter all along. So the future that is ahead of us sometimes is dark and foreboding and ominous and mysterious, but prophecy shines a light on that. And we know that God's providence in the past and his prophecy yet to come is as sure as anything that you could, as sure as night follows day. So studying this history only gives me greater faith and trust in the God of heaven as providentially leading all of us, of all nations and all people. So that's it for that session. I hope you enjoyed that Civil War one. I almost forgot the Civil War part. That was like the capstone of it all, straight from Spirit of Prophecy. It's fun to hear it from George Washington and others where they say what happened and say they believed it was providence, but then you hear it from the pen of inspiration. Well, let's transition to Q&A as brief or long as you'd like this afternoon. And we can talk about religious liberty. Do we want to use a mic this time? We were doing some informal Q&A at the beginning. People asked about 501c3 status and concealed carry and non-combatancy. We've already hit some interesting stuff. But we can pick up those topics or anything from the Pilgrims or American history that you'd like, and we can follow the Lord's leading. I don't have the answer, but when we do Q&A, it's not that like the speaker and the teacher, because he's studied history, has all the answers. This is a corporate exercise, so I want to hear your thoughts as well, not just your questions, especially at Fairplain. I have a high regard and respect for the minds and the convictions here at this church. So, all right, first question.
I'd just like to make the point that a lot of people assume that the First Amendment disestablished the established churches across the board as soon as it was adopted, but there were several states that still had established churches.
Most of them, actually, yeah.
After the American Revolution. The last one to disestablish was Massachusetts in 1833.
He's got the date.
We
talked in the foyer. I said, you like history, don't you? I love it.
The First Amendment, as originally intended, only prohibited the federal government from establishing religion, not the states.
Exactly. And do you know the name of when the Supreme Court applies the Bill of Rights to the state? Did you learn yet the glossary term for that? Anybody? I'm quizzing you guys now. I'm doing Q and you do the A. Oh, I love teaching about this in government class. It's the doctrine of incorporation. They said, well, hey, these rights are so important that, hey, the 14th Amendment says, as of 1865, the 14th Amendment says any citizen of the United States cannot have their rights taken away, and so we're going to take the Bill of Rights one by one, and when we see states taking away people's rights, we'll go ahead and apply the First Amendment to the federal Constitution to the states. So it extended liberty beyond where it had been, because, you could have an oppressive state. Under the federal Constitution, the federal government had very limited powers. I mean, they couldn't end slavery, right? I mean, that's kind of a violation of people's rights, huh? So really good point. Yeah, during the early republic, there was still some learning yet to do on the part of the states, like, hey, we do want to separate church and state. Now, interestingly, some people take that fact as we went the wrong direction when Massachusetts and these other states finally disestablished. We ought to have, it's that dominion theology idea that really wants to bring back church and state unification. So I sometimes hear your, dominion theology advocates point that out in an effort to try to limit the power of the First Amendment so it doesn't apply to states, it only applies to the federal government. So important theme to explore. Should those Bill of Rights be incorporated down to the state level or only applied to the federal government? 14th Amendment gave the courts the opportunity, which I think has been appreciated by most people. Most law enforcement happens at the state level anyway, or county or municipal level. So the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the trial by jury, all of those rights, the rights of the accused, very much need protection against state intrusion, not just federal intrusion. However, you could say that you win the battle and lose the war because you've now empowered the federal courts to make it illegal for states to prohibit third trimester abortions or first trimester abortions, like Roe versus Wade, right? That was incorporating the Bill of Rights and bringing liberty to women, not having states intervening in them. So it is a double-edged sword. I'm talking a lot. Do you want to say anything else? You took your mic away already. I'm sorry. Do you have any thoughts on that? We'll pick it up later. It's fine. No pressure. We could talk all day about that. Over here.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
So I had a class about Adventist history, and the professor was saying how, so when you talked about Revelation 12, about the earth helping out the woman, he said that the traditional Adventist view is exactly what you said, coming to the United States. He also mentioned Uriah Smith, how when he speaks about it in Revelation, in Daniel, the book that he wrote, he said he gave the impression that Uriah Smith, like many of the church founders, were looking at it, we're coming from a perspective very, very English or very British, like as if the United States was kind of like the hero and everything. And he said he had an interaction one time with an evangelical scholar that made a comment that the Adventist Church solely looks at the United States as if the United States was the only territory available. And he said, well, you had people in South America, you had people in Mexico, you had people in China and everything. So how do you, he's like, how do you just look at the United States as if there was nobody there, or there was few people there? And so the people that came over, the reformers or the Protestants, when they came over, he's like, you only put it there when you should look at other nations. And he said, that's something we gotta consider, and not just be so close-minded about just the United States. So I went home with that thought. In the following class, he said, does anybody have any comments or questions about that statement? I said, yeah, I think it's one thing to look at I think it's one thing to consider all the other kingdoms and everybody else living across across the globe. However, God's focus is not those other people.
Yeah. God's
focus was the people that, his church, the people that were actually trying to follow him and continue because of the prophecy. So what do you say to that?
What you said is absolutely correct. I couldn't add to it. I completely agree with you. I mean, we take our cues from prophecy and what God has said, not like what we think would be just and fair and whatever. And to focus on the second piece of Bible prophecy and the earth helped the woman, to focus on that being a New World historical reality is not to diminish the soul or the value of somebody in East Asia or South America or anything, because it's from this land that the truth was to go as streams of light clear around the world. So it's because our care and concern is for every single human being in their eternal salvation that we identify that springboard from which the truth went to them. It just happened to happen here. That's just a historical reality. The Pilgrims didn't go to, Taiwan or Uruguay or whatever. I mean, there are a lot of places in the world, but the place that they went, the place that prophecy points to, just happens to be this place. And I hope that if I would have the objectivity to say that if I wasn't an American, it would be better if a non-American was giving this seminar. Because somebody would be like, you just are red, white, and blue, patriotic, like chest-thumping guy, so you're going to look at it through those lenses. So, I am an American, so it's hard to deny that there might be a potential for bias there, but we all try to be objective, and we go to the Bible and we say, where is this, and when is this, and what is this, and for what purpose is this? And that's the key, the what purpose. Then you deny any claims of prejudice or superiority or nationalism, and you say, this is for every human being, right? It's the gospel. Now, your other comment of your professor was absolutely important, because I've received this feedback, actually, after doing this seminar, and I should have woven it into the message, but I didn't. The word that I use to describe, and you've probably heard this in your prophecy seminars, when we talk about the earth versus the waters, it's not that the waters is multitudes of people and the earth is no people. It's a relatively it's less populated or sparsely populated, is I think how I phrase it this morning. So it doesn't deny the value of every Native American soul, and that's why it's such emphasis on Winslow's missionary work to them and how they were such good people to objectively look at the Pilgrims and see the unity. It's a message of unity, but some people get offended if you say a more sparsely populated area because, you're diminishing the value of the people, the Mesoamerican peoples. Well, you had South America, you had the Incas, the Aztecs and stuff. They were heavily populated areas and were decimated by gold hunters and enslavers in the Spanish Empire. Absolutely horrific, dark epochs of human history with the conquistadores. You also had some civilizations in the North American, Native American history, but those predated by centuries the arrival of the Europeans. You had, woodland tribes in Northern America. They were sparsely populated, though. So that fact doesn't diminish the quality of one human soul. Jesus would come and die for one human soul. It's just a numerical reality, not an assessment of value. That the population of New England was much less populated than the population of England per capita, per square mile. So, and I would like to actually see a breakdown in the numbers of that. So you can see, okay, it's not just 3 or 4 times more, it's 10 times more population density in England versus in New England or whatever. That would be an interesting pursuit of study. That's what we always do in academics. We say, this is what we know, here's what we want to know. So I commission anybody who wants to do that study to go figure out population density there. And that would be a fun exercise to further validate the prophecy so that we don't get these revisionist views coming down like the traditional Adventist view. That's just what the Bible teaches. I mean, you can call it that and then depart from it under the guise of some some, tolerance or academic wisdom or enlightenment in human wisdom, but, that's dangerous. I think we need to stick with the Bible. So I would love to, have that conversation too. I think you engaged in it in a very positive way. It was probably smart to wait till the next day too. That's sometimes a good thing to do, so you're not in the heat of battle in the moment. You get your ducks in a row. Okay, what is my thought about this? Let me study it a little bit, and then I'll engage with a professor that seems to be introducing some level of skepticism of Bible prophecy. So, yeah. Anyway, more questions. Go for it.
So what I'm noticing most recently is a push, or almost an edict by some, to rewrite history, to redefine previous terms and events, definitions, to some new agenda-driven whatever. And unfortunately, there's people that do not know proper history, don't care to look back to find out for themselves, and they're taking for granted what they're being fed right now, which is a complete different rewrite of what actually happened. And of course, there's a bunch of finger pointing. And anyway, comment.
Yeah, it's happening. It was happening to a certain extent when I was studying in college. That goes back 20 years now, and there's always been this seeking to undermine what I believe is the principles of Protestantism, and they wouldn't have known that or called it that. I went to a Protestant Christian college. I was not Adventist at the time, but there was always these subtle underminings and skepticism of what we know to be true, and you might excuse it as mere academic exercise and intellectual curiosity and sharpening our thinking. Really, under that guise, you get people that end up with crumbling and cracking foundations on what they know is biblically and historically true. But hey, the big thing right now is we don't know what is true. There is no truth. So I'm losing more and more faith in academia with each passing year, because I've been out of it. I finished my master's program in 2007, so I've been out for 15 years. This has been the craziest 15 years, or maybe the last 10 or whatever, that you've ever seen in American history, in terms of the shifting of ideological frameworks and things that are absolutely false being widely accepted as true under some name of tolerance or justice or whatever nice-sounding names and words. So you're talking about the rewriting of history. Absolutely, it's been rewritten. And why during divisive times, it's beyond me why we as Christians especially, but even all humans, don't delight in finding the positive stories like we told this morning to bring people together. And I go back to the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King Jr., and the idea of not judging people by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, and all these things that I grew up with. A fairly, I guess you would call it, more liberal view of humanity and human rights and stuff. And it's like, I'm having a hard time finding anybody with that traditional, liberal, generous view of human rights and unity. And it's like a regressivism has taken over in the name of progressive. So these ideologies, I think, are dangerous, not just a matter of historical facts and we're doing revisionism and getting the facts wrong. I think it takes us to Marxism. In fact, somebody who's done a lot of good work on that is Conrad Vine. He's done a series on wrongthink and on critical race theory and some of these ideas. Spot on academically. I can tell you that from my perspective at least. So anyway, good question.
Don't you think that's going to sway? Because they're starting to say that the Founding Fathers wanted religion in the Constitution. Are you not familiar with that as a rewrite?
Are you talking about the Dominion theology? People are saying that we ought to unite church and state again?
Right.
Oh, yeah. In fact, my first foray into this whole ideological skirmish was in 2008. I wrote a book before we were Adventists. I finished it. We became 2008 and Adventists. But right before we were become Seventh-day Adventists, my wife and I, we were teaching at an evangelical Christian school. Very conservative evangelical Christian school. And this was during the time of the Bush administration, post 9/11, war on terror, Iraq, and it was kind of like the idea at that time was Christian militarism and blow them all away in the name of the Lord, to quote Jerry Falwell. And as a Christian at that time, more or less, I mean, I'd grown up Christian. We really learned a lot and grew in our personal faith, going into that 2008, as I was mentioning, with coming into the truth. But even what I knew at that time, I knew something's not right here. And like Jesus says, don't lord it over like the Gentiles do. So today, when I'm speaking and doing Q&A or doing a presentation, it might sound like it's coming from more one perspective, but if you would go back 14 years, oh, Ritsema is such a this and that, and it was the opposite of what people might say today. So your warning is true. And we need to heed that warning as well as the dangers that Conrad Vine is pointing out and that we've been dialoguing about here, because it goes back to these two, doesn't it?
Faith cannot be regulated.
Yeah, exactly. You're talking about a religious right that can do tremendous damage to religious freedom. And that's been the traditional, if you will, the more go-to thing that we consider as dangerous to freedom. As Adventists, we know the Great Controversy, we know the Declaration of Independence, we know the Constitution, and we say enforcing Sunday observance comes straight out of the papal playbook. Presently, this one is speaking like a dragon, if you will, more, but we know this is coming. And they may fuse in weird ways that we don't expect. Like this current pope. I mean, look at his ideology, and a lot of it is borrowed from this kind of thing, and the environmentalism and all of that. And then you get public health thrown in there. Like, where did that come from? We knew pestilences were coming, but we didn't know all of that was coming. So anyway, keep them both in mind. And that's the thing. We human beings have a difficult time holding two ideas, complex ideas in our head simultaneously, both of which are true. It's like we have to swing to one or the other. And so in our warning against that danger, we don't want to jump into that boat. And so that's a hugely important comment that you made, and I appreciate it a lot. And I started here. Not here. I started warring against that idea, and then more recently seeing this crop up as an even bigger clear and present danger to religious liberty. I'm talking about that as well, but I don't want to stop talking about that. So very good comment. I appreciate that. More questions for Q&A. I like Q&A. This is fun. I like hearing you guys' thoughts. You got another one? He's wanted to do a second. If anybody wants first, but go ahead.
I thought of something else that I could have said before. I was reading a book where it was talking about the history of the United States when the states were disestablishing, and it had a quote from a clergyman in New Hampshire who was opposed to the disestablishment of the Congregationalist Church in New Hampshire. And when the state voted to disestablish the church, he was devastated, and he wrote in his diaries that this was a tragedy. But then he saw later how the church actually was affected by the loss of the support of the state, and he came around and he changed his mind later, and he wrote later that was actually good for the cause of the church, that it was healthier, relying more on God and on its own membership rather than the support of the church.
Amen.
So,
you mean the support of the state?
Or the state,
yes.
Yeah. So
yeah,
it's just
amen.
Anecdotal that one person's opinion, however,
he's right.
It fits in with.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that comment. Yeah, he's absolutely right. We don't need that kind of help, do we?
I'm trying to think how to word this so it makes sense, but thinking of what's happened with the pandemic and not being allowed to go to church, churches were closed down, and now it seems like we're kind of back to normal. How do you see what's going on in our world right now with separation of church and state and freedom of religion because of the pandemic? Has it gone back to the way it was, or are we still really limited on our freedom to worship? What kind of trend do you see happening?
The trend is going the wrong direction. Right now we do have what is like a reprieve. It kind of, does everybody feel like you're taking a breather and bracing yourself for the next wave of whatever is going to be thrown at us? It's like birth pangs. They're intensifying. So I wouldn't sit on our laurels. And, you mentioned the church closures and how that relates to separation of church and state. Most people would phrase that as a free exercise clause issue. The First Amendment has the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. The Free Exercise Clause says that you're allowed to exercise your religion freely without regulation by the state. The Establishment Clause says that there should be no established church. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And so most would frame the church closures as, hey, they prohibited our freedom to practice religion. And that's true, and that's absolutely correct. You mentioned the Establishment Clause, and I was like, you know what? It is kind of an Establishment Clause issue. Because when pastors and church organizations are basically deputized by the state and the public health agencies to enforce public health regulations, then you are wedding the two. If you don't require X, Y, and Z of your congregants, then you're in trouble. You've been deputized at that point. I don't know if pastors feel that way. I would have. I was just dialoguing with a pastor about this literally just 2 nights ago, writing an email back. And I said, how long did you guys have your church closed for? And his spin on it was, well, we never closed. Because church just means the called out ones, and we were meeting online for 3 months, and then after that we met outside together. They're in California, they have that luxury. It's always cold at Fairplain when we come down here, by the way. Why? I said, well, what would you do if you couldn't worship outside? 3 months of not gathering. And I asked him, what is he's redefined, and I think I don't envy the role of a pastor. The job of a pastor is hard during COVID, okay? I'm not saying I could do it better. I'm not a pastor, so, but I think in a way to preserve your own sense of your own integrity, you redefine terms to meet the situation where you feel you have no choice. The word church means to assemble. Not just the called out ones. It's called out to assemble. So I was very disappointed to hear, and this is not anybody that, we're friends, okay? It's a positive relationship. This is not meant to be a criticism, but I guess you could say it's a helpful critique of where we've ended up. With the church closures, we did close the assembly. That's what the word church means. Because he's like, well, we closed our building, and that's just the meeting house. Okay, if you met outside together every Sabbath, then you did not close church. True. So your general question, though, the direction we're going, I don't know. There's backlashes, and they have to pull back when they see resistance of people saying no. And so we seem to be in one of those phases now, and it's hard to gauge the magnitude of that and when's the next wave going to be and how much of persecution. But we can say that it's certain to come biblically, and a lot of it is unpredictable because it depends on what kind of events transpire, because the events precipitate the reaction on the part of the powers that be, or you could say the events are to a certain extent manufactured and so on. But anyway, that's, I think, enough on that one. I hope I didn't say too much.
It's easy for us to get comfortable with what our normal is. A.T. Jones, in the book The Two Republics, addresses the fact that in the early days of our country, the ministers were actually being paid as, from the state funds. Mm-hmm. People were being forced. And then who was it that said, isn't the laborer worthy of his hire? And the comment was, yes, for those who hire them.
Yeah, exactly. Who are you working for?
Right.
You working for the state?
Right. But he brought out the point that even to have tax-exempt status for churches is a compromise because it's requiring greater taxation for those that are not choosing a religious. So you're giving a cut to this whole religious organization that things should be freely and voluntarily given. So already there was a mingling of church and state simply by the tax-exempt status.
I accept that that's an argument one could make. I won't push back against you too hard on that. That's food for thought. You expected me to go to war on that one, didn't you? That's good. We got another one up here, but one over here too. Boy, yeah, this is the first one from this side. I've been standing on that side of the podium the entire Q&A. All right.
I don't know if you touched on this earlier because I was kind of walking all over the place, but the Liberty and Health Alliance event that happened in Arizona, can you just for people's information here, talk about how, maybe shortly touch on how God worked to make that come together so quickly? Because it's just amazing to think the size and scale of that and how many tens of thousands of views that it's gotten online already. And And then maybe touch on some results from that event.
My favorite results story is there were some people who were not of our faith at the event, and one of them walked up to one of our leading organizers and said, now I don't know what religious perspective you guys are from, but what you are teaching and standing for truth and liberty on this issue, I want to be a part of your church. So they were ready to be baptized, and they didn't even know what we were. So that's going to be a pretty quick series of Bible studies, I think, there. So praise God for that. As far as how it came together, miraculously, I've never seen anything like that. I've never heard of anything like that. And to secure a venue like that, which requires a network of people in high places in city government and battling against entrenched interests that are very much against any pleas for liberty of conscience and that are bought into the public health dictatorship, if you can call it that. There was attempted sabotage, not attempted. Is this being live streamed? Okay, I probably shouldn't get too specific, but because it would need to be a group effort to decide what to share publicly and so on. But we saw some crazy stuff, and I'm not just usually when you talk about we started an evangelistic series and the power went out and stuff like that, and you see the devil trying to mess with things. There was definitely some of that, but there were also some interventions of human agencies of influence that. The kind of stuff that if I were to start telling you stories of what I've been through over the past, what's it been, almost a year, it sounds crazy. It sounds like something out of James Bond or something crazy like that. So,
could you just tell us what this is? Because some of us
okay. What is Liberty and Health Alliance, and what was this Phoenix event? Got to catch you up. So Liberty and Health Alliance was founded in last summer, June of 2021, I believe. And it was basically an effort and a desire for several like-minded, either health professionals or just religious liberty-minded people, attorneys, who said, we're not satisfied with the voice yet that our church has found in speaking to these relevant and important issues of our time, the liberty crisis of our time, vaccine mandates first and foremost. And we want to be a voice for the voiceless. We want to really speak truth at a critical time in Earth's history, and in doing so win souls to Christ, because we're reflecting the character of God with our religious liberty message, and a message on health as well as Liberty and Health Alliance. The way that the organization even came together last year, not to mention the event in Phoenix, the big venue that was secured, as I mentioned, in downtown Phoenix, that was just in January. That was miracle after miracle after miracle that made that event possible. But it was also amazing, miraculous intervention to even bring the organization into being it was at the end of May. I mean, I'm getting contacts from people that I haven't heard from in years, and they're like, you need to talk to so-and-so because I know you and this person are like mine. And I'm getting on the phone and I'm like, this is exactly what I was praying for. And right after I saw this, and this, and then heard that this was being arranged, that I needed to be on the phone with these people and that we need to be starting to do something and take action in this area. It was the clearest direction of providence. Quite honestly, not something I really wanted to do, to form this organization and invest a lot of time in it. And I love my family and ministry and everything I'd been doing. And you find where you feel like your niche is, and then you're thrown into something that God's put you in, that you're involved with. That it's not as much as his. It's more His will than yours. So anyway, Liberty and Health Alliance. You can visit libertyandhealth.org and see what we are all about there. So I mentioned I have two ministries. You got the Belt of Truth and 11th Hour Dispatch. This is kind of a side one that I just kind of help to give some legs to, and I'm not that big of a deal over there. My ministry, we run that just as a family, but Liberty and Health Alliance has gotten very prominent, very important, I think, in these times in sharing the truth about liberty of conscience on health matters. And part of the reason for that is, by the way, I am not sick. Earlier I got something down the trachea and it's still bugging me, but on the matter of health and religious liberty, people have said, well, we're only supposed to speak to issues of religious liberty that relate to the 10 Commandments. And choosing to take or not take a vaccine is a matter of one's choice, sure, but it's not it doesn't reach the level of a religious liberty concern because it's not touched upon in the Ten Commandments. And so you guys are out of line to raise an issue, and you're being rebellious against the government by saying, people should have the right to apply for religious exemptions, and we want to help them with that, and we want to be a voice against such overreach and respecting people's individual freedom. You guys are out of line to go there because we're supposed to just obey the government, whatever they say, until it touches on something in the Ten Commandments. This is a challenge or a critique that we've received, and actually this was in that same email earlier that I was talking about with, we didn't close the church. I asked, if you're confronted with an argument like that, I recommend answering the question with a question. They're asking you which commandment in the 10 is being trampled on by government vaccine mandates. My answer is, which commandment of the 10 were Daniel and his friends being asked to violate when they were asked to compromise on their health convictions? And you start scrolling through the 10, and that might be a hard question, just as hard as the question about the vaccine mandates. I have my answer, but I'm still waiting to hear back from some people who I've posed that question to. Sometimes you get dead air after that question, but my answer is the first commandment. The first commandment. Have no other gods before me. It is the ultimate commandment of my life being a life of worship to God, and there is nothing as personal and worshipful and spiritual as how we deal with the temple of the living God. The temple is where God's Spirit dwells. Other than what day you worship on, I can't think of a more worshipful principle than how do I deal with the very temple of God. It's not a matter of worship, it's just your personal belief. What I eat, how I exercise. We're talking about Seventh-day Adventists. We've got a health message. We know that health choices are spiritual choices. So the first commandment is, have no other gods before me. And I'll tell you something. When it says in Romans, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, that's worship language as well. It is your reasonable service, your body being offered to God as a living sacrifice, worship language, and it is your reasonable service, or some of the modern translations say your spiritual act of worship. So Paul in Romans 12 is telling us about our body being something that is a sacrifice to God in the worship sense, and in a spiritual act of worship or a reasonable service. So the idea that Seventh-day Adventists would have any doubts in our minds about the fact that health choices are spiritual choices, it is not a dilemma I saw us encountering. I think it's only the context that we've faced that has drawn that strange theology out to say, well, I guess Daniel and his friends should have just eaten the food, because it's rebellious for them to request an objection or request an exemption. But Daniel and his friends requested an exemption based on their convictions that food would be wrong for them to eat, and they knew that if they were denied that exemption, that they would either starve or they would cut off their heads. Even their supervisor thought, oh, he's going to cut off my head if I ask him for that. How much more Daniel and his friends, who are the ones doing the asking, their lives were on the line. So, I've also heard, pastors should just tell their congregants to be martyrs. You're fighting against the government, and we're not supposed to fight against the government. Just be a martyr and take whatever you're told to take, even if you don't feel like you can do it in good conscience before God. And I found that to be such a turning upside down of the reality of what a martyr is. A martyr is willing to die for their convictions, not buckle to the pressure because to keep my job or whatever. And by the way, I'm not condemning or convicting or preaching or taking a position on what anybody else should think about vaccinations. I will say, every one of us, if we would have as a church, I kind of off topic from the question, but when you ask Liberty and Health Alliance, you're going to get a 10-minute monologue. But it's been a lot of division in our Seventh-day Adventist church, broadly speaking, over the vaccine mandate issue. The path to unity is the path of acceptance, tolerance, and pluralism in many cases. And I'm not saying we compromise truth, but if we as a people would have said, you know what, this is a difficult choice that many people are facing. It's a new technology. Some people are hesitant. Other people are like, please get me on the front of the line. I don't want to die. And different people are in different places with this. We're going to leave room for everybody to make their own call on that and not come down with statements and declarations and positions that we all supposedly hold, because then you alienate half of the church who don't feel that way. So if you from the beginning say, we're leaving space for everybody, as the Lord leads, we have this on vaccination, we have silence in the spirit of prophecy on it, and present some of the ideas, the for and against, and leave people free to decide. But when we get statements that are imposed as this is what you believe, because you are a Seventh-day Adventist, that's problematic, and that becomes divisive, rather than appeals for freedom. The appeal for freedom is, hey, can we also be included and involved? Can we be a part of this movement even though we feel differently? And can we get some help with the persecution that's coming down on us because of our vaccine status? So basically what that came down to was we ended up seeing neutrality on vaccination abandoned and statements made in favor. And then silence on the mandates and leaving people swinging in the wind. But then a step further, we went beyond silence on the mandates and got statements in favor of mandates. You talk about divisive. So I know I'm bringing up divisive because Liberty and Health Alliance has been accused of, oh, you guys are divisive. But really it's been an appeal for unity the whole time. Leave people free to decide on vaccination status, and be sure to defend people's liberty of conscience when it comes to such an important and personal decision. If there were prohibitions against it, we would defend people's right to take something that they want to take because they believe God leads them to take it. This is about individual freedom and conscience. And when we go there, we could have unity. And LHA, Liberty and Health Alliance, hasn't touched this one, but when it came to mask wearing, and you have churches that are, you may not enter the building without a mask, that is another form of exclusion and excluding people rather than having tolerance and plurality allowed to hold sway. That's something I think is just as important. In fact, it was the precedent-setting phase to the vaccine mandates was enforcement instead of diversity, unity and diversity. Come as you'd like, whatever you're comfortable with, wear one or don't wear one. And always been advocating for that even since before LHA. So those are some of the current religious liberty issues. I know they're a little more dicey, a little more controversial than it's easy to talk about history, although it's not so easy to talk about history these days. But I'm sure Pastor would like to chime in on some of this. Or, no? Feel free. You want to chime in on anything? No? Okay. He was scratching his head. But yeah, those are decisions that leadership makes, and I'm not in leadership, so it's easy to sit on the sidelines and say, this is what ought to happen, but we sure have been suffering because of that stuff that transpired. But I think we can move past it. I think we can move beyond it. I think we can learn from the history, learn from our mistakes, and say we're not going to do that way again. Am I being too optimistic? Yeah. Anyway, let's go to another question, or should we wrap up? We're 2 hours in for the afternoon. Yeah, judge not lest you be judged. Yeah, very good addition. Oh, you got the mic back there. He's been waiting. How long have you been waiting? I'm sorry.
No, it's just like a minute. Don't worry.
Yep.
Well, I have a comment and a question. As a comment, I just want to say thank you to you and to the Liberty Health Alliance, because my mother actually had the issue at her job. Many of the members here are aware of that. They were praying for her, that she needed to submit some form of either that she was going to get vaccinated, she's been vaccinated, or an exemption letter. And I told her about what was on the website. And so we downloaded that and the Bible study as well. And she submitted it. And up till now, she still has her job.
Praise God.
The state and the federal agents are in there for another reason, because it's a nursing home.
Oh.
But she's still working there. There hasn't been any issues. And they actually told her letter was one of the best ones that they had received. So thank you.
I'm going to tell Mr. Zirkle that. Jonathan Zirkle drafted that. He's the legal vice president with Liberty and Health Alliance, and huge fan of all the work he's put into that.
Yeah, they said it was very thorough and to the point, and so, but other than that, she hasn't had any issues. My question is, have you heard of the 1776 curriculum that came out?
Yes. Who's behind that again?
It's interesting because I think that company or ministry, it's very similar, like the name is similar to Religious Liberty and Health Alliance.
Okay.
But I was looking into it, and they say it's a free curriculum for schools, for parents, for teachers, for anybody.
I love
churches.
That's great.
All you have to do is just make a donation, but they're willing to give the whole curriculum from K through 12, and it's going against, it's like a response to the 19 that they're pushing in schools.
Well, and I applaud that, and I also echo a warning from earlier. Not all of the evangelical, patriotic, Constitution-loving people out there understand this fine line that we walk. Some of them will take you over here. So beware whenever it comes to any of that kind of historical presentation that's trying to establish our principles. Rarely do you see problems these days, right now. There have been more in the past, and they will probably arise again. But for now, that is an awesome answer to the craziness that we're getting in the public schools right now with children's history curriculum. Do we have another question? All right.
Okay, so I don't know if this, or if it relates to like church and state, but what are your thoughts on universities getting funded by the government? Like, how is that church and state, or is just, you call it something else?
Are you talking about religious universities or public universities?
Yeah, like Southern Andrews.
Yeah, it would be kind of like, the tax-exempt status isn't money coming in, but it's an advantageous position versus corporate entities that have to pay a 21% tax or whatever, or 33 or whatever. It's graduated depending on your corporate status. But universities, historically, public universities have had that relationship with the government naturally, because they're public universities. Christian universities have said, can we get our hand in that, in that pot too? And could that lead to compromises that you make? Yeah, when you're taking money, you have to ask, are there going to be strings attached? Are there ways that I am subtly adjusting my approach so as to not bring down on my institution the ire of the government? It's a dangerous game to play. So you can maybe evaluate the fruits of it and say, has it worked or has it led to some problems? That's a question. I don't have all the answers on that. Maybe some of you have some thoughts. You're a little closer to a university town than I am up in northern central Michigan, but I do see some concerning developments in our time. I do, in terms of the philosophical approach that's happening in our own academia. The limited exposure that I do have. I kind of am glad that I turned down that option of going that route when we were New Adventists and fired up, and it's like maintaining that the word isn't independence, because you don't want to be a lone wolf, but not being dependent on institutional inertia and institutions with their allegiances that may not be entirely what the direction the Lord is leading us. So that's where I'm coming from, and again, that's from the outside looking in. Easy to say. Maybe some of you are in the trenches and doing your best and trying to bring reform, and I encourage you on that. I think that there is absolutely a place to press forward in that work and try to bring light and truth into dark places, may I say it. I think we're done. Come on down. Oh, he wants me to stay up here.
Have you been blessed today? We're really happy you could come, Scott.
Thank you for having me.
It's a blessing to have you here and your messages. And we know you have a lot more to say. You kind of had to restrict yourself to these few hours. I also want to thank Kimberly Jang, our religious liberty leader here at Fairplain, for organizing this Sabbath. We really appreciate that very much. You said you were an American. It made you not credible. Well, I'm of a non-American origin, and I can confirm you're spot on.
Praise God. Praise
So
God.
just continue preaching your messages,
Amen.
and you know that, of course.
Amen.
But be it Americans or non-Americans, you will realize that liberty of conscience is one of the most precious gifts
Amen.
that has been handed to us as in a crucible. And it took centuries to get where we are today.
Yeah.
Centuries of martyrdom, of struggles, of endurance, of setbacks, to finally arrive at where this country and the world eventually reached. And it's been entrusted into our hands.
Yes.
And actually, you had that testimony of Arizona meeting with that family becoming convicted to join the church because of the message on liberty of conscience.
Mm-hmm.
Did you realize that the message on liberty of conscience is an evangelistic
It is.
message?
It is. We handed out thousands
It's not
of great
just a
controversies.
principle
Yeah.
here and there at the periphery. It's an evangelistic tool. Let me just share, maybe you know this, but
Yeah.
Mount of Blessings, page 33, paragraph 2 says, the minds of the people must be agitated.
Yeah.
Listen carefully, follow
This is
me.
good.
Every controversy, every reproach, every effort to restrict what? Liberty of conscience is God's means of awakening minds that otherwise might slumber.
Yep.
So there is a message in sharing the truth on liberty of conscience, and that has been entrusted into our hands.
May I add something to
Yeah,
that?
sure.
Because it phrases it as if these attacks on liberty of conscience are plural and numerous and of various kinds, right? It says everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas sometimes we get pushback that it's only one thing at the end of time that is of our concern on religious liberty. But it says everyone along the way is where we are developing credibility with the world that we really do believe in this stuff. And it's not just for us, just at the end of time.
It's multifaceted, you
Yeah.
could say,
Yeah.
from different angles. But all have one common thing together, and that's the liberty of conscience. You know, we talk about religious liberty, but liberty of conscience goes even deeper, and that's the very issue at the core. Well, thank you so much again for coming, and I think there's one hymn, perhaps the last stanza in that hymn, that would be great and appropriate to close this afternoon with. Which hymn do you think that could be? It was authored by one of the reformers who initiated this 5 centuries old journey for liberty of conscience. And that's Martin Luther. And what's the name of that hymn? A mighty fortress is our God, 506. Let's sing the last stanza, and the words are really interesting and I think appropriate, and then we'll ask Scott to have our closing prayer after that last stanza is sung. So let's stand up and sing 506, stanza number 4, A mighty fortress is our God.
Let's pray. Father, we are so thankful that your truth abideth still. These seem like very dark times. There's fear, there's darkness, there's confusion, there's oppression, there's division, there's hate. But we know your truth abideth still, and your kingdom is forever. Kingdoms rise and wane, but your kingdom stands for all of time. May we be a part of that kingdom. And may it come in its fullness soon, because we reflect your love to the world. May the gospel go forth. May our hearts go to the lost, and may we be filled with your Spirit to proclaim more fully the present truth for this time. Take advantage of the limited window of liberty that we have now, and that many souls would be won unto your kingdom, and Jesus would come again soon. Give us the strength, Lord, to stand for the right though the heavens fall, to stand for truth even if it means at our own demise. We know that we will have a better resurrection in that day, or translation unto heaven that will be like nothing we've ever imagined. We want that day to come soon. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you for coming. God bless you all. And I think you're available for questions.
Oh, yeah, we'll hang out for a few.
Thank you.